He signed the exclusion order without hesitation. A quick, automatic gesture, performed hundreds of times before. To the system, it was just another name condemned to erasure. To him, just another report closed. But that night, when silence took over the complex and the lights dimmed, something impossible awakened. The connection. Raw, intense, undeniable. It didn't come as a dream or a thought. It came as a physical impact, a late recognition. He had authorized her end, and yet he felt that something essential had been activated. A bond that didn't ask for permission. A choice made too late to be undone. He had always believed the system was perfect, because it never forced him to feel. The world might look normal on the outside. People going to work, lights on, crowded streets. But behind that appearance existed an invisible gear that decided destinies without needing to raise its voice. The system observed from an early age, evaluated patterns, corrected deviations. And when it couldn't correct, it eliminated. Directors like him were the final hand of this logic. Men trained to sign without hesitation, to trust numbers more than their own intuition, to believe that any doubt was merely human noise. He signed exclusion orders like someone closing a file, with precision, efficiency, distance. Nothing personal, nothing emotional, nothing that could compromise stability. She, on the other hand, was the type of case the system called inevitable. Accumulated failures. Insufficient adjustments, persistent incompatibility, a name that fit nowhere, and therefore had to disappear without leaving a trace. When the order was signed, the gears followed their normal course. The system registered, archived, and moved on. But that night did not follow the pattern. In the silence of the complex, when the routine slowed and the corridors grew empty, something that should never have existed within that structure awakened. The connection, not as a simple romance or coincidence, but as a blunt impact. A link that bypassed control, rank, and logic. He felt it in his body before he understood it in his mind. A pressure in his chest, a jolt of recognition, as if something inside him had been activated too late, after the decision had already been made. And she, somewhere on the other side, felt it too. The system had marked the end, but the connection did not obey endings. And when something wakes up in the dark, no one ever sleeps the same way again. Before we continue, leave your like. This helps this channel grow a lot. Subscribe as well, because I have a personal dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers, and every single subscription makes a real difference. And comment below which country you are watching from. I love reading the comments, and it helps the channel reach more people. Now, let's go to the story. Night fell over the complex without any sign that anything had changed. The external lights dimmed automatically, the corridors grew empty, and secondary systems took control of the basic routines. For all intents and purposes, this was just another closing of a cycle. One more exclusion recorded. One more name removed from the active flow. He remained in his office longer than usual. Not because of pending work, but because of a restlessness he couldn't explain. The report was already filed. The order duly signed. The protocol advancing without obstacles. Still, something inside him refused to settle down. He tried to rationalize. It. Accumulated fatigue. An excess of repetitive decisions. The system demanded absolute constancy, and even directors felt the weight of it at some point. He stood up, walked to the glass wall, and observed the complex in silence. Everything was working perfectly. No alerts, no visible failures. That was what made the discomfort so disturbing. He couldn't remember her face clearly, only technical fragments, graphs, notes, cold words like incompatible and recommended closure. Still, the name surfaced in his mind with uncomfortable insistence. Not as data, as a presence. He decided to leave. The commute to his residence was short and silent, as always. The external world completely ignored what happened behind the walls of the system. People passed him in the streets, oblivious to the fact that invisible decisions had been made that very night. That had always brought him a sense of absolute control. That night, it brought only emptiness. Upon entering his home, the silence felt denser than usual. He left his coat on the chair, washed his hands mechanically, and turned off the lights, following a routine he knew by heart. Nothing changed. Everything was exactly as it should be. That was when he felt it. It didn't come as a thought. It didn't come as a memory. It came as an impact, a sudden pressure in his chest, strong enough to make him stop in the middle of the hallway. His breath hitched for a second, and his entire body reacted as if it had been struck by something invisible. He moved his hand to his chest by reflex, his heart beating far too fast for a body trained for control. It wasn't pain. It was recognition. The sensation spread brutally, accompanied by disconnected images that didn't seem to come from his own mind. A cold space, an artificial light, a heavy silence. He didn't see clearly, but he felt it. A presence on the other side of that perception, as real as the floor beneath his feet. He leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. It made no sense. There were no active devices, no open channels, no reason to feel something like this. The system didn't allow connections outside of controlled protocols. It was impossible. Still, it was happening. At that same instant, in a distant sector of the complex, she woke up with a start. The dark room seemed smaller than before, the air too heavy to be just a dream. Her body reacted as if it had been pulled out of rest by force, her heart racing, her breath shallow, the clear feeling that she was not alone. She sat up in bed, her eyes searching for something she couldn't see. The exclusion had been confirmed hours earlier. She knew that. She had felt the weight of the end approaching, the certainty that her existence within the system was about to be erased. Still, this night did not follow the expected script. Something had awakened, a strange pressure in her chest, mirroring exactly what he felt at that moment, ran through her body. It wasn't fear. It wasn't despair. It was late recognition, as if something inside her had been touched after the decision had already been made. She placed her hand on her chest, feeling the warmth spread slowly. Confused images surfaced in her mind, not as memories, but as impressions. A man standing in a hallway, a dim light, a heavy silence. She didn't know him, but she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that this presence was linked to her exclusion. Back in the dark hallway, he closed his eyes, trying to control his breathing. The impact didn't diminish. On the contrary, the feeling of connection became clearer every second, as if something were aligning despite all the logic he had learned to respect. The connection had awakened, not as something chosen, not as something desired, as a consequence. He understood this with disturbing clarity. The exclusion order had not closed the case. It had activated something the system had never foreseen, something that did not obey hierarchy, control, or time. She, sitting on the cold bed, felt the same understanding slowly form. The exclusion hadn't been just the end. It had been the trigger. Something had been awakened precisely when everything should have been over. And, in that shared moment in the dark, both understood the same thing. That signed order could no longer be undone, but the connection that had awakened that night could not be erased either, and the system still had no idea what had begun. He didn't sleep. He tried, but every time he closed his eyes, the sensation returned with even more force, as if his body refused rest until it understood what was happening. The house remained silent, but that silence now felt far too heavy. There were no outside sounds, no system alerts, and yet something pulsed in the back of his mind, demanding attention. He stood up again and walked to the living room, feeling the cold floor beneath his bare feet. The pressure in his chest came in waves, not constant, but far too precise to be ignored. Every time it surged, it was accompanied by the same uneasy certainty. This was not a random reaction. It was a response. He tried to rationalize it. Connections didn't happen outside of protocols. Echoes between administrative decisions and physical reactions did not exist. The system had been built specifically to eliminate this kind of human interference. Yet, the more he tried to push the sensation away, the more it organized itself, as if resisting only strengthened the alignment. On the other side of the complex, she paced through the small room, feeling her entire body in a state of high alert. Her sleep had been abruptly interrupted, and now the idea of lying down again seemed impossible. The air felt heavy, almost too dense for her lungs. The exclusion should have left her empty. Instead, she felt filled by something she didn't know how to name. She tried to sit, then to stand again. Her body reacted strangely, as if it were adjusting something internal that had never been activated before. It wasn't common anxiety. It wasn't panic. It was a presence. A clear awareness that someone, somewhere, was feeling the same. He stopped before the window, observing the distant city lights. For the first time in years, he felt out of control. The position he held had always given him enough emotional distance to remain untouched by individual decisions. People came and went. The system kept running. That night, however, had torn through that barrier silently. The pressure in. His chest increased when he thought of her consciously. Not as a report, as a person. The effect was immediate, strong enough to make him lean his hand against the cold glass pane. The connection responded to the focus, as if recognizing it were enough to intensify it. She felt the same impact at the same instant. She was standing in the center of the room when the sensation deepened, almost making her lose her balance. Her heart raced, and a frightening clarity took hold of her mind. This was not imagination. It was not an emotional consequence of the exclusion. It was something active, reactive, sensitive to the thought on the other side. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, and realized that whenever she tried to deny the sensation, it returned with more force. But when she accepted its existence, even without understanding it, something stabilized. The idea left her uneasy. To accept such a thing meant giving up the certainties that had kept her alive until then. He moved away from the window and sat down slowly, running his hands over his face. This couldn't continue like this, not without an explanation. Instinct, dormant through years of discipline, began to manifest with uncomfortable clarity, not as uncontrolled emotion, but as firm guidance. There was something wrong with the exclusion. That certainty formed effortlessly, too solid to be ignored. It wasn't late regret. It was the clear perception that the signed order had activated something that should not have been activated. Not in her, in him. She felt the same conclusion surface on the other side, though in different words. The exclusion hadn't been just an end. It had been a trigger, something inside her, which had always seemed out of place, now fit into something larger. This perception left her frightened, but also strangely calm. He stood up suddenly, determined. He couldn't act impulsively, but he also couldn't pretend nothing was happening. He needed to see the data again. He needed to understand what had been activated that night. In the silent room, she stopped pacing and sat on the bed, feeling the connection stabilize for a brief moment. It didn't disappear. It just waited, as if it knew something was about to change. He knew that accessing her file again was against protocol. The exclusion had already been authorized. Any review would require a formal justification. Still, the thought of not looking became unsustainable. This wasn't curiosity. It was a necessity. She felt the impact when he made the decision. She didn't know how or why, but she perceived the exact moment when something on the other side moved with clear intent. The internal alignment intensified, as if the connection recognized the choice. He opened his portable terminal and accessed the system outside official hours. The screens lit up silently, displaying the file that should have remained closed. Her name appeared, accompanied by the status, "Exclusion in progress." The pressure in his chest increased. He realized, with disconcerting clarity, that this night was not just a late emotional consequence. It was the start of a conflict, because the system had marked the end. But something that night had awakened too late to be ignored, and too early to be controlled. The terminal illuminated the room, with a glow far too cold for that hour of the night. He remained motionless for a few seconds, staring at the open file in front of him as if he hadn't been the one to call it back into existence. Her name appeared there, accompanied by codes indicating authorized exclusion, execution pending. Everything followed the normal flow, at least officially. The pressure in his chest returned with force the instant he read the status. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't common regret. It was something deeper, more specific, as if that line of text were in direct disagreement with something he felt in his entire body. The system said one thing, instinct said another. He began to read the reports, with an attention he had never dedicated to closed cases. Initial evaluations, follow-up notes, technical comments that had been ignored because they didn't fit the dominant patterns. As he advanced, a clearer image formed, not of failure, of density. She had never responded poorly. She responded too much. She thought beyond what was asked. She felt before she acted. In a system built for efficiency, that was interpreted as a delay. In a system built for control, it was seen as a risk. No report considered the possibility of it being a foundation. He felt his instinct intensify as he read, not as a sudden emotion, but as a firm alignment. Every piece of data that confirmed the exclusion also confirmed something even more unsettling. The system didn't know what to do with her because she exposed its limits. On the other side, she remained seated on the bed, feeling the night drag on with uncomfortable slowness. The room seemed smaller than before, as if the space were closing in around her. Still, the sense of presence remained stable. It didn't pressure, it observed. She realized that whenever her mind quieted, the connection became clearer. It didn't come as a voice or a sharp image. It was more like a shared field of consciousness, a silent certainty that something was being seen, reviewed, reconsidered. When he moved to a deeper section of the file, he felt a brief, dry jolt that made her bring her hand to her chest again. Not pain, instant recognition. She knew, without any logical explanation, that he was reading something that had never been read with attention before. This left her uneasy. She didn't want to be reviewed. She didn't want to be analyzed again. She had spent her entire life trying to survive technical gazes that sought to fix her. Still, this feeling was different. It didn't come loaded with judgment. It came loaded with intention. He found an old note, lost among standard evaluations. A brief comment from a junior observer years ago, discarded, for lacking statistical weight. It simply said she demonstrated a capacity to sustain emotional complexity without collapse. That had been classified as irrelevant. To him that night, it became central. Instinct reacted with enough force to make him lean back in his chair, sustaining complexity. That wasn't a defect. It was something rare, something the system needed, even without admitting it. The error wasn't in her. It was in the structure's inability to recognize value outside the pattern. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision signed hours earlier. The exclusion hadn't just been an administrative correction. It had been an attempt to erase something that didn't fit, because it couldn't be reduced. She felt the exact moment he reached this conclusion. The connection intensified suddenly, almost making her catch her breath. A clear, deep alignment that brought with it an emotion she didn't expect to feel. Validation. Not complete relief. Not safety. Just the recognition that for the first time, someone was looking at what she was, and not at what was missing. He opened his eyes, determined. He couldn't simply reverse the exclusion without triggering high-risk protocols. Any direct intervention would be recorded. Still, allowing the process to follow through now seemed impossible. Instinct would not accept it. He accessed a secondary level of the system, reserved for emergency reviews, a rarely used feature, designed for cases where execution needed to be temporarily suspended due to technical inconsistencies. Officially, that would require a later justification. In practice, it would buy time. The decision was made in silence. In the room, she felt the change even before any external confirmation. The pressure in her chest eased slightly. It didn't disappear, but it changed in quality. The environment felt less hostile, as if something had been shifted behind the scenes. She stood up slowly, walking a few steps through the small space. Something had been interrupted. The end would not arrive tonight. She didn't know why or for how long. She just felt it. The system recorded the suspension with a minimal delay. Status changed. Emergency review initiated. No alarm was triggered. Yet, he watched the update with his heart beating faster than he cared to admit. That was the first real deviation he had committed in years. Not small, not reversible. From that moment on, the case ceased to be just a closed file. It became a responsibility. She sat back down, feeling exhaustion finally catch up with her body. The connection remained firm, silent, as if it recognized the postponement as something necessary, but insufficient. There was no victory there, only time. He turned off the terminal and remained in the dark for a few seconds, breathing deeply. He knew the system did not tolerate prolonged reviews. He knew audits would come. He knew that delay would have consequences. Still, there was no regret, because something had awakened that night. And now, both he and she knew that the exclusion could no longer be treated as routine, not after the connection had woken up. The emergency suspension brought no peace, only too much silence. The kind of silence that doesn't mean rest, but expectation. He knew this as he watched the clock move slowly, aware that every extra minute increased the chance of the system detecting the irregularity. Emergency reviews were not done in the dark. They were tracked, analyzed, and questioned. Still, his instinct remained firm. He accessed the main panels again, now with redoubled caution. He was no longer looking for immediate technical justifications. He was looking to understand the impact. Her exclusion was connected to other flows, other automatic adjustments that spread through the system like invisible waves. Removing someone was never an isolated act. It always generated small chain corrections, and those corrections were strange. Some indicators did not stabilize as they should. Small deviations appeared in sectors that had nothing to do with her case. Nothing critical, nothing alarming, but persistent enough to catch the eye of someone who knew what to look for. The system was compensating for something it didn't fully understand. He felt a shiver as he realized the implication. Perhaps his instinct had been right from the beginning. Perhaps her exclusion was not just unfair, but structurally wrong, like removing a piece that seemed secondary, but supported more than it appeared. On the other side, she felt time passing differently. The room seemed suspended outside the complex's usual routine. There were no warnings, no agents entering or leaving, just the continuous sensation of being kept outside the normal flow. Not forgotten, but separated. The connection remained present, now quieter, but deeper. It didn't surge in blunt waves like before. It was a constant thread, almost comforting, though it carried a weight she still didn't know how to interpret. It wasn't safety. It was shared consciousness. She tried to lie down again, but her body wouldn't relax. Her mind insisted on returning to that moment when everything should have ended. The signed exclusion. The accepted end. And yet, something had kept her there. Not by her own strength. Not by request. By someone else's choice. This perception left her restless. He knew he couldn't maintain the suspension for long without justifying it. The system would demand formal explanations soon. Emergency reviews had a deadline. When the deadline expired, execution was resumed automatically, with even less room for interference. He had to decide the next step. Reversing the exclusion would require a direct confrontation. Maintaining the suspension would require continuous manipulation. Both options put him at risk. The difference was that one of them aligned with his instinct. The other only postponed the inevitable. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the choice form with uncomfortable clarity. For the first time since taking office, he realized that the system did not offer him a correct decision, only possible decisions. In the silent room, she felt a sudden change, not physical, internal. The connection reacted with slight tension, as if something was being considered with seriousness on the other side. Her heart raced, and she sat up immediately, feeling that this was not a trivial moment. She didn't know what was being decided, but she knew the decision would involve her completely. He opened a restricted channel, a level above emergency reviews, a space rarely used, reserved for cases classified as potential systemic risk. Activating that channel didn't mean accusing the system of failure. It meant admitting that something escaped standard logic. It was a dangerous step. The system responded with minimal delay, displaying discrete warnings of expanded supervision. This meant that, from that moment on, his actions would be monitored by higher instances. He had accepted this the instant he confirmed access. In the room, she felt the pressure in her chest increase for a brief moment, followed by a strange stability. Not relief, not fear, a state of total attention, as if something was being officially recognized, even if not explained. He began to compile data, not to prove she was compatible, but to demonstrate the opposite, that the system was treating complexity as an error. Every graph, every report, every ignored deviation began to form a dangerous narrative, one that didn't ask for integration. It asked for structural revision. That had never been done because of a single individual, and that was exactly what made everything so unstable. She took deep breaths, trying to keep her body calm. She didn't want that connection to become a dependency. She didn't want to exist only because someone chose her. Still, she couldn't deny what she felt. Something was being moved, because of her, and that put her in a position she had never asked for. In the control center, the system began to react. Discrete alerts appeared more frequently. Nothing critical yet, but enough to indicate that the investigation had not gone unnoticed. The system did not like to be questioned in its foundations. He felt his instinct react with firm clarity. There was no more room for a comfortable retreat. Any attempt to turn back now would only confirm the instability that the system was. Beginning to associate with him, he had crossed an invisible boundary. In the silent room, she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the connection align with that perception. There were no words. There were no promises. Only the certainty that this night had ceased to be just an isolated event. Something larger was in motion. And from that point on, neither of them could pretend that the connection awakened in the dark did not exist, because the system had already begun to respond. The system was not slow to react, not with alarms or direct accusations, but with something more subtle and dangerous: silent reorganization. He noticed it in the small delays, in the responses that came back incomplete, in permissions that were once automatic and now required extra validations. The system was not confronting him. It was testing his limits. He continued gathering data, knowing that every second was being watched. The reports began to form an unsettling picture. Whenever her name appeared, in old projections, there were small subsequent corrections in sectors that were seemingly disconnected, collective behavior adjustments, redistributions of emotional load across entire groups, as if her presence had served for years as an invisible buffer. The exclusion broke this balance. He felt his instinct react with controlled force. This was no coincidence. The system had benefited from her without ever recognizing her. Now, by trying to erase her, it was revealing its own dependency. This realization was too dangerous to ignore. In the silent room, she felt her body react to something she couldn't see. There were no messages. There were no agents. Still, the connection pulsed with varying intensity, as if responding to distant movements, sometimes stronger, sometimes almost imperceptible, always present. She began to perceive a pattern. When the sensation intensified, it was accompanied by an emotional weight that didn't seem to be just hers, fatigue that wasn't hers, tension that hadn't been born in her body. It was as if something was crossing that link, bringing echoes of decisions made far away. It terrified her. She didn't want to be a channel. She didn't want to carry conflicts she hadn't chosen. Her whole life she had been forced to bear the expectations of others. The idea of now sustaining something even larger made her catch her breath. Still, denying the connection seemed impossible. It did not obey her will. It simply existed. He interrupted the analysis when he noticed a deeper pattern. Whenever the system recorded collective emotional instability above the expected level, there was an indirect correlation with negative evaluations directed at her, as if, by putting pressure on her, something reorganized elsewhere, an emotional domino effect that no one had ever owned up to. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of that discovery. If he was right, the exclusion was not just an administrative correction. It was an amputation, removing something that absorbed tensions that the system didn't know how to process. In the room, she felt a sudden wave cross her chest, strong enough to make her sit on the floor. Not pain, overload. Emotions that weren't hers mixed with her own, creating a knot difficult to undo. She closed her eyes, breathing with difficulty. For the first time, she felt anger. Not at him, at the system, at the structure that demanded so much of her without ever explaining why. That called her an error, while silently leaning on what she sustained. The anger brought an unexpected clarity. Perhaps she hadn't been discarded for being weak. Perhaps she had been discarded for being too strong in an inconvenient way. He noticed the change at the same instant. Not in the data, in the body. Instinct reacted with a new urgency, almost protective. Something in her was being pushed beyond the limit, not by direct intent, but as a consequence of the intensifying conflict. He knew he had to act before the system transformed that tension into a justification to resume the execution. Any sign of collapse would be used as definitive proof of incompatibility. He opened a new panel, one that was rarely accessed outside of broad crises. A reverse containment protocol, not to isolate her, but to reduce the systemic impact on her. Officially, it made no sense. In practice, it was the only way to protect her without announcing protection. In the room, she felt the effect almost immediately. The pressure eased. It didn't disappear, but it became bearable. The air seemed less heavy. She breathed deeply, feeling her body relax a little. Someone had intervened again. This realization brought relief and fear at the same time. He watched the indicators stabilize gradually. The system had accepted the adjustment, although it had marked it as an anomaly. Another silent record. Another future justification to question his conduct. He accepted this without hesitation. She stood up slowly, feeling her body tired but whole. For the first time since the exclusion, she didn't feel on the verge of collapse. Still, the connection remained firm, now with a different quality. Not just reaction, silent communication. Not words, not clear images, just the certainty that he was taking real risks. It made her close her eyes for an instant. She had never asked to be chosen, but now that she had been, she couldn't pretend that nothing had changed. In the control center, he faced the alerts that continued to surface with increasing frequency. The system was preparing for a more direct confrontation. He knew. He felt it in the way the data began to align against him. Still, the instinct remained unshakable. The exclusion could not be resumed, not after he understood what was at stake. In the silent room, she walked to the small window and looked at the outside world she could barely see. The world went on normally. People slept. Lights went out. No one knew that. On that night, something essential was being disputed in silence. She leaned her forehead against the cold glass, feeling the connection pulse with steady constancy. The system believed it still controlled the outcome, but something had awakened too late to be contained, and too early to be ignored. And both knew that the night was not over yet. The dawn arrived without true light. The sky remained overcast, and the complex awakened in silent layers, as if nothing extraordinary had happened during the night. To the system, this was merely the continuation of a process under review. To him, it was the beginning of an inevitable confrontation. He felt it the instant he accessed the central panels again. There were no direct messages, but the indicators were tighter, less flexible. The system had reduced margins, eliminated temporary exceptions, and reinforced automatic protocols. It was a clear response. The observation phase was over. The exclusion was not canceled. It was only postponed. He took a deep breath, feeling his instinct align with uncomfortable clarity. There was no longer a way to protect without exposing himself. Every adjustment made in silence during the night would now demand a formal explanation. The system did not accept prolonged improvisations, let alone decisions based on something that could not be measured. In the silent room, she woke with the feeling of being pulled into consciousness even before she opened her eyes. The connection was different, more stable, but charged with alert. There was no pain. There was readiness, as if something were about to cross an invisible boundary. She sat up on the bed slowly, feeling her body react with extreme sensitivity. Every distant sound seemed sharper. Every thought came weighted with significance. The exclusion still existed. She knew that. The suspension was not liberation. It was an interval. The system confirmed this perception shortly after. A brief notice appeared on the wall. No details, stating that additional evaluations would be conducted throughout the day. It wasn't a direct threat. It was a reminder of power. The process had not been forgotten. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her stomach contract. Evaluations meant exposure. They meant tests designed to provoke failure. Still, something inside her remained firm, not resigned, present. In the control center, he received the complimentary notification almost at the same time. Expanded evaluations, cross-supervision. This meant the system was gathering enough data to resume the execution with total backing. There would be no room for emergency reviews after this. He felt the weight of the decision become unbearable. Either he moved forward now, openly, assuming total risk, or he would allow the system to win through exhaustion. Instinct did not hesitate. He opened a channel that had never been used for individual cases, a structural risk declaration protocol. Officially, this existed for extreme scenarios when automatic decisions threatened the integrity of the system itself. Activating it for a single person was something that had never been done. The system responded with minimal delay, displaying discrete critical alerts. That access would not go unnoticed. Audits would be inevitable, personal consequences as well. In the room, she felt the impact at the same instant, not as pain, but as a profound displacement. The connection intensified in an almost overwhelming way, forcing her to brace her hands against the bed to keep her balance. Something massive was being activated. She breathed deeply, trying not to resist. The sensation did not ask for control. It asked for presence. As she accepted this, the pressure eased slightly, transforming into clarity. She was not being saved. She was being defended. In the control center, the panels began to visibly reorganize. Processes were forcibly suspended. Automatic flows entered a state of containment. For the first time, the system faced a declared internal blockade. He felt the full weight of the choice fall upon him. There was no longer any possible retreat, not after that access. The system now classified him as a potential instability, not an error, a risk. In the room, the warning on the wall vanished without explanation. The lighting shifted subtly, becoming more neutral, less aggressive. She felt her body relax slightly, though the internal tension remained alive. The system had been forced to stop, for now. She stood up and walked to the center of the room, feeling the connection stabilize at a new level, not explosive, deep, as if something had been officially recognized, even if not accepted. In the control center, he watched the critical alerts pile up. He knew this truce would be short. The system did not tolerate direct challenges for long. Still, he had achieved something essential: time. Time to prove that the exclusion was not a correction. It was a structural error. In the silent room, she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her own breath align. For the first time since she had been marked for exclusion, she did not feel at the mercy of the process. She wasn't free yet, but she wasn't alone, and both knew that the next move could no longer be silent. The system would demand a resolution, and any resolution would change everything. The system responded as it always did when challenged openly, with strategic coldness. No public alerts, no immediate punishments, only silent adjustments that shifted the balance without announcing intent. He noticed it in the denied accesses, in reports that came back incomplete, in the extra validations required for actions that were once automatic. The system wasn't confronting him. It was isolating him. He felt his instinct react with hard clarity. This was the most dangerous phase. When the system didn't attack, it was preparing the ground to make any intervention impossible. Her exclusion was still listed as pending, merely suspended by structural containment. Removing that blockage would be enough for everything to advance too quickly to be stopped. In the room, she felt the effect of this same maneuver as a change in the air, not physical, but perceptible. The connection, which had remained stable, began to oscillate slightly, as if something were trying to interfere with the alignment, not to break it, to weaken it. She placed her hand on her chest, breathing deeply. Her body recognized that kind of pressure. It was similar to previous evaluations when the system tried to provoke failure without exposing itself. The difference was that now, she wasn't facing it alone. He noticed the oscillation at the same instant, not in the data, in the instinct. Something was trying to cross the connection, not to break it, but to make it irrelevant. The system couldn't eliminate her directly while the structural risk protocol was active, so it sought another approach. Decoupling, separating effects, isolating influences, making the link lose strength until it ceased to be a relevant factor in the equation. He felt a dry tightness in his chest. That was dangerous. The connection wasn't just an emotional bond. It was what sustained the clear perception that the exclusion was a structural error. Weakening it meant returning everything to its previous state. He had to act before the system completed the process. In the room, she closed her eyes, concentrating on her own breath. She realized that whenever she resisted the oscillation, the sensation worsened. But when she accepted the existence of the connection without trying to hold on to it, something stabilized. It didn't disappear. It adjusted. She couldn't fight the system the way he did, but she could choose not to break. This realization brought an unexpected calm. He opened a panel he hadn't accessed in years, an internal communication channel between directors, rarely used outside of global crises. It wasn't a request for help. It was a record, a mark impossible to erase afterward. He began to document, not emotions, not sensations, consequences, correlations, systemic deviations following her exclusion, data showing how the system reacted poorly to the attempt to erase her. That wasn't a personal defense. It was structural proof. Every record sent strengthened the risk of direct retaliation. In the room, she felt the connection stabilize again, now with a different quality, less intense, deeper, as if it had learned to exist without depending on constant force. That surprised her. The system had tried to weaken the bond, and had ended up refining it. She sat on the bed, feeling her body finally relax a little. For the first time, she realized she didn't need to sustain everything alone. Her simple presence, without collapse, was already resistance. In the control center, the first effects of the record began to appear. Alerts surfaced in higher layers, not of punishment, of attention. The system now had to deal with something more dangerous than an unstable director, a documented precedent. He felt his instinct react with firm clarity. There was no more comfortable return. This wouldn't end with a simple reversal or a silent execution. The system had been forced to recognize that her exclusion was not just an isolated case. It was a problem. In the room, she stood up and walked to the wall, touching the cold surface with her fingertips. She felt strangely whole, not safe, not protected, but present in a way she had never been allowed before. She didn't need to prove anything at that moment. The system did. In the control center, he watched the indicators change slowly, not in his favor, but outside of absolute predictability. The system was being forced to recalculate something it could no longer ignore. The connection had not been broken. It had moved through the attempt to weaken it, and that made everything more dangerous. Because now the system knew it wasn't just dealing with an incompatible individual, it was dealing with something that resisted without direct confrontation. And in that state, there was no clear protocol for correction. The system took a long time to respond to the records because it needed to recalculate something that had never been predicted. Precedents were not part of its logic. It existed to prevent exceptions from becoming patterns. Still, the data sent by the director could not be ignored without leaving traces. Each recorded correlation created a discrete fissure in the narrative of absolute efficiency. He felt the pressure increase steadily. There were no critical alerts yet, but the isolation had become more evident. Some channels simply stopped responding. Others returned generic messages, empty of real content. The system was protecting itself, reducing his reach before acting in a definitive way. Instinct remained firm, but it now demanded precision. It wasn't enough to resist. It was necessary to direct. If the system was trying to turn the connection into irrelevant noise, he needed to make it visible without exposing its nature, a balance far too delicate to be maintained for long. In the room, she felt the stability hold, but she noticed something new. The connection was no longer reacting only to his actions. It was reacting to hers. Every time she took a deep breath, every time she accepted her own presence without trying to justify herself, the alignment strengthened in a subtle way, not as active defense, but as internal coherence. She understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that the system had always tried to break her by making her doubt herself. Evaluations, corrections, exclusions. Everything revolved around making her believe she needed to change in order to exist. Now, by simply remaining whole, something resisted on its own. This realization brought a dangerous calm. He noticed the change at the same instant. Instinct reacted as if something had clicked into place outside the data. The connection no longer depended solely on his interference. She was sustaining herself. That changed everything. The system could isolate directors. It could not erase internal coherence. He accessed one last resource before it was taken from him. Not a technical protocol, but a human impact report, rarely used because it didn't produce easy numbers. He inserted her case as a central example. No names, no identifying details, just exclusion patterns, systemic reactions, and invisible consequences. It did not accuse. It revealed. In the room, she felt a wave of deep fatigue cross her body, followed by a strange relief, not because the danger had passed, but because something had ceased to be sustained only by tension. She sat on the floor, leaning her back against the wall, and closed her eyes for a moment. For the first time, she didn't feel the urge to run. He finalized the report and sent it to the highest level of observation, knowing that this act ended his room for maneuver. After that, any action of his would be seen as direct interference. The system now had to deal with what had been exposed, or publicly admit that it ignored its own flaws. The silence that followed was heavier than any alert. In the room, the environment remained unchanged, but the feeling of being besieged diminished slightly. It didn't disappear. It just receded. The system was not advancing. It was evaluating risks. This, in itself, was a partial victory. She opened her eyes, feeling the connection stabilized at a deep, almost silent level. There were no more spikes. There was no more shock. It was like a tacit agreement to exist without asking for permission. In the control center, he leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the choice settle with definitive clarity. He knew he would lose access, influence, perhaps his position. Still, he felt no regret. The exclusion had not just been postponed, it had been questioned in its essence. The system did not respond immediately because it couldn't. Any response now would create precedents larger than her case. In the room, she took a deep breath, feeling her entire body relax for the first time since the order was signed. She wasn't free. She wasn't safe. But she wasn't being erased. And in that world built to eliminate what does not fit, remaining whole was a radical act. Both knew the next move would not come at that hour. The system needed to decide if it would admit the flaw, or if it would attempt an even deeper correction. And when that happened, nothing could be reversed without real consequences. The system responded indirectly, as it always did. There was no official statement, no abrupt change that could be pointed out as a failure. What changed was the pace. Processes that were once automatic began to require manual confirmations. Flows that used to close on their own stayed in a state of indefinite waiting. The system was defending itself the only way it knew how, by slowing down. He noticed it immediately. The slowness was not an error. It was strategy. The more time the system gained, the easier it would be to dilute the impact of what had been revealed. Precedents weakened when they lost urgency. The danger was not her immediate exclusion, but a calculated forgetting. Instinct reacted with firmness. This could not be allowed to drag on. If the system managed to turn the case into administrative noise, everything gained that night would be lost without a direct confrontation. The exclusion wouldn't be resumed with violence. It would simply be normalized. In the room, she felt the same movement as a strange hollow. Not hostile, not aggressive, just a gradual absence of pressure. The connection remained, but something in the environment seemed distant, as if the system were trying to convince her that nothing else was happening. This unsettled her more than the moments of siege. She realized, now with clarity, that the system preferred apathy over conflict. People adapted more easily to silence than to threats. This most effective erasure was not the abrupt end. It was the slow dissolution. She stood up, walking through the space with firm steps. She didn't want to be dissolved. She didn't want to go back to existing only as a forgotten note. For the first time, she felt the urge to act, even if she didn't know how. In the control center, he became aware that he could no longer be the sole point of support. His influence was being drained progressively. If he continued acting alone, the system would simply bypass him until no impact remained. It was necessary to shift the axis. He accessed a set of rarely used protocols intended for the redistribution of sensitive cases, not to erase the exclusion, but to pull it out of the common circuit. That wouldn't set her free, but it would prevent her from being forgotten. In the room, she felt the change as a slight internal displacement, not a new pressure, but a reorganization, as if something had been moved from a fragile place to a more stable space. The connection reacted with silent clarity. He confirmed the redistribution with a single command. There was no emotional justification possible, only technical. The system accepted, marking the case as a transversal analysis, a rare label, used when an isolated decision revealed implications too broad to remain local. That was dangerous. Transversal cases were not eliminated quickly, but they were also not easily resolved. They required collective review, prolonged exposure, time. A lot of time. In the room, she sat down again, feeling deep fatigue mingle with a strange sense of steadiness. There was no promise of safety. Still, something had been won. Visibility that could not be erased without leaving marks. She thought for the first time that perhaps she didn't need to escape that world to exist in it. Perhaps it was enough to occupy a space the system couldn't reduce. In the control center, He watched the panels reorganize once more. The system had accepted the shift, but now classified it as a persistent risk. There was no immediate punishment, only continuous surveillance. That meant his direct involvement was, in practice, over. He accepted this with a calm that surprised him. Instinct no longer asked for frantic action. It asked for sustenance. The exclusion had been prevented from becoming routine. The connection had resisted the weakening. The system had been forced to recognize something it could no longer pretend didn't exist. In the room, she closed her eyes for an instant, feeling her own breath align. She wasn't free. She wasn't safe, but she was present in a way she had never been allowed before. The slow dissolution had been avoided, and that changed everything. Both knew the next step wouldn't depend only on them. The system now had to decide if it would face its own flaw, or if it would try to live with it. And in that prolonged uncertainty, something essential remained intact. The connection had not awakened to be resolved. It had awakened to exist. The system never announced final decisions when it lacked absolute certainty. It preferred to close cases in silence, diluting impacts until no one remembered what had been lost. But that exclusion had not dissolved. It had become a fixed point, a constant weight in a gear made to glide without resistance. She felt it now with clarity. The space around her remained the same, but something had definitively changed inside her. The exclusion still existed in the records. The risk was still real, and yet there was no longer that feeling of being at the mercy of invisible forces, not because she was protected, but because she had stopped reducing herself. She stood up and walked to the edge of the room, feeling the firm ground beneath her feet. For the first time, she wasn't waiting for an order. She wasn't awaiting a verdict. Her existence was no longer suspended in expectation. It was anchored. The connection remained there, silent, stable, without urgency. It didn't demand physical proximity. It didn't promise a future. It existed as an irreversible recognition, something awakened too late to be denied, and too early to be erased. On the other side of the structure, he observed the panels without actually expecting answers. His role was no longer the same. The system kept him functional but distant from critical decisions, an elegant form of neutralization. Still, what needed to be done had already been done. Her case had not been closed. It had not been corrected either. It had been exposed. He knew the system would learn to live with that living flaw, not because it accepted it, but because eliminating it now would require admitting limits it could not afford to own. The exclusion remained suspended not out of compassion, but out of a structural inability to conclude. That was enough. She felt the change before any formal notice. Not a liberation, but a deep stabilization. The constant weight she had carried for years, the feeling of needing to justify every breath, simply ceased to exist, not because someone had given her permission, but because she was no longer seeking it. She had not been chosen to be saved. She had been recognized too late to be discarded. The system would continue to function. It would continue excluding, correcting, erasing. But now it carried something it couldn't fully process, a point that didn't fit, and yet sustained more than it seemed. She closed her eyes for an instant, feeling her own presence occupy the space without resistance. There was no triumphant victory, just truth. On the other side, he accepted the silence as the final answer. There would be no thanks. There would be no official recognition. But there would also be no forgetting. The system would never again operate with the same illusion of perfection, because on that night, something had awakened. Not an error, but a connection that revealed everything the system tried to ignore. And when that happens, no control remains intact. For long. If this story touched you in any way, leave a like now. It helps this video reach more people. Subscribe to the channel as well, because I have a personal dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers, and every single subscription makes an enormous difference in this journey. And comment below which country you are watching from. I read all the comments, and it helps the channel grow and reach even further. Thank you for staying until the end. Some decisions seem final, only because one expects what they awaken afterward. The system believed that to exclude was to end, that to erase was to resolve. But there are things that do not obey the logic of control. She wasn't kept because she fit in. She was kept because she revealed something the system did not want to see. The connection did not emerge to save, nor to promise a perfect future. It emerged to expose limits, to show that not everything can be reduced, classified, or silenced without a cost. Sometimes the error is not in the one who fails, but in the structure that demands silence to function. He signed the exclusion, believing it closed a cycle. On that night, he discovered that some choices do not end when they are made. They begin. Not all resistance screams. Some simply remain. And when someone stops asking for permission to exist, the system might even keep functioning, but never in the same way again. This story was not about exclusion. It was about what awakens after it.